Hello and welcome to the Military History Club's Great Battle in 10 Minutes feature. Today I'm going to be talking about the Battle of Yalu River. The battle was fought near the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China, between the United Nations troops and their South Korean allies on the one hand, and the armies of the People's Republic of China on the other hand. It took place in late November 1950, during the first year of the Korean War. The origins of the war go back to the last weeks of the Second World War, when, at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, US President Harry S. Truman gave Stalin a free hand to deal with Japanese troops in Korea and Manchuria. All this changed after the dropping of the two atomic bombs and Japan's unconditional surrender a few weeks later. US troops were now available to take part in the occupation of Korea, and their presence would help to prevent the whole country from becoming communist. So Truman's government suggested to the Soviets that they limit their advance to the 38th parallel, a horizontal line roughly halfway down the country that was chosen by two Pentagon officers on the grounds that below it lay Seoul, the capital, more than half the population, the best agricultural land, and most of the light industry. To Washington's amazement, the Soviets agreed. So came into being Soviet-sponsored North Korea and US-influenced South Korea. In June 1949, the last American troops left the Republic of South Korea, by then governed by Dr. Syngman Rhee's elected but increasingly authoritarian government. The Soviets had already pulled out of North Korea, leaving behind a rigidly disciplined Stalinist government under their protege, Kim Il-sung, who in September 1948 had proclaimed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Relations between the two embryo countries worsened with a series of border incidents until, on the 25th of June 1950, North Korea invaded the South with a 135,000-strong army supplied with Russian tanks and planes. South Korea's army, by contrast, was just 95,000 strong and had few planes and no armor. The attack was condemned by a US-sponsored resolution in the United Nations Security Council, the Soviet delegation having walked out the previous January, and President Truman immediately ordered his troops to assist South Korea as part of a UN police force. General Doug MacArthur was put in charge and told to limit his operations to repelling communist aggression in the Korean peninsula. But he did not believe in the concept of limited war and regarded the fight against communism as one to the death. His first act was to rush 3 US divisions, designated the 8th Army, to South Korea from Japan. They were under strength, under-trained, and under-equipped, and could do little to stem the North Korean advance. By the end of July, the 8th Army survivors and the remnants of the South Korean Army had been driven back into a southeast corner of the peninsula known as the Pusan Perimeter. Thanks to reinforcements, including the US Marine Brigade and the British 27th Brigade, the perimeter held just. Then, on the 15th of September, MacArthur launched his masterstroke, an amphibious landing by the 10,000 men of the 10th Corps at Incheon, halfway up the western coast near Seoul. It took the North Koreans completely by surprise, and, as 10th Corps drove east, the 8th Army began its long-awaited breakout from the Pusan perimeter. Attacked from two directions, the North Korean front collapsed as troops began to melt away, discarding weapons and equipment as they went. On the 26th of September, American troops linked up at Osan. The following day, Seoul, the capital of South Korea, was recaptured. Already 125,000 prisoners had been taken, and the North Korean army was in full retreat. The issue now facing the US government and its allies and military commanders was how to gain the greatest political advantage from their success. The obvious next step was to cross the 38th parallel, destroy the remnants of the North Korean army, and unite Korea under a democratic government. But the UN mandate only extended to the rejection of communist troops from South Korea, and this had now been achieved. Furthermore, the Soviet delegate had resumed his seat at the Security Council and would undoubtedly veto any extension of that mandate. Without referring the matter to the Security Council, the US government authorized MacArthur to finish off the People's Army in North Korea. There were, however, provisions. He was not to go ahead with operations if major Soviet or Chinese forces, or both, proved a threat. His forces were not to cross the Manchurian or USSR borders of Korea. Since 1948, Manchuria had been part of Communist China. No non-Korean ground forces were to be used in the northeast provinces bordering the Soviet Union, or in the area along the Manchurian border, and finally, he was not to support his operations by using air or naval power against Manchuria or against Soviet territory. On the 9th of October, the 8th Army crossed the 38th parallel. For a week, the North Korean troops put up a stern resistance. Then they broke, fleeing north with the US 1st Cavalry and 24th Infantry Divisions in hot pursuit. With total victory seemingly in his grasp, MacArthur was called to a meeting with President Truman on Wake Island in the Pacific. He assured the president that formal resistance in North Korea would end by Thanksgiving and that he would withdraw the 8th Army to Japan by Christmas, leaving only 10th Corps as an occupation force. In the unlikely event of the Chinese intervening, his air force would commit the greatest slaughter. If the Russians supported the Chinese with planes, their incompetence would cause them to bomb the Chinese as often as they would bomb us. MacArthur's assurances seemed to have the desired effect. "I've never had a more satisfactory conference since I'd been president," Truman told reporters. On the 19th of October, Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, fell to the South Korean 1st Division. The UN troops, meanwhile, were continuing their largely unopposed advance. On the 25th of October, 10th Corps made a second amphibious landing at Wonsan on the east coast of North Korea. There were no casualties, because South Korean troops had taken the city 2 weeks earlier. The day before the US 1st Marine Division splashed ashore, Bob Hope had given a show intended for US troops. But as the 8th Army moved ever closer to the Chinese border, and the British proposed the establishment of a buffer zone south of the Yalu River, jointly policed by the Chinese and the UN, MacArthur made clear his contempt for diplomatic niceties. The widely reported British desire to appease the Chinese communists by giving him a strip of North Korea, he wrote to his superiors, finds its historic precedent in the action taken at Munich on the 29th of September, 1938. On the 24th of October, MacArthur issued a new directive removing any remaining restrictions on the deployment of American troops towards the Manchurian border. His senior commanders were authorized to use any and all ground forces as necessary to secure all of North Korea. When the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington queried this order, he ignored them. That MacArthur was not immediately sacked was because he was a talisman. Quite apart from the fact that he was a hero of the Second World War, he, and he alone, had been responsible for the miracle of Incheon. Outright military victory was now tantalizingly close, and American politicians were intoxicated by the scent of success. In any case, MacArthur had assured them that he could easily deal with any Chinese offensive. At the root of all American action, wrote Max Hastings in The Korean War, lay a contempt, conscious or unconscious, for the capabilities of Mao Zedong's nation and armed forces. The Americans certainly had plenty of warning. On the 2nd of October, the Chinese Premier, Chu En-lai, had informed the Indian ambassador that China would intervene if the United Nations crossed the 38th parallel. Truman dismissed the threat as a bold attempt to blackmail the UN. The first South Korean troops reached the Yalu River on the 25th of October. That same day, the South Korean 2nd Corps, moving north on the left of the UN advance, was attacked and almost destroyed. Its assailants were identified as Chinese, but General Walker, commanding the US 8th Army, sought to explain away the presence of Chinese troops by pointing out that a lot of Mexicans live in Texas. There were further indications that the Chinese were about to attack, yet the Americans refused to believe them, even after the CIA had reported that there were 40,000 Chinese troops already in Korea and a further 700,000 poised across the border in Manchuria. Washington remained convinced that Peking would not or could not operate independently of Moscow. On the 25th of November, having celebrated Thanksgiving the day before, the UN troops resumed their advance. But as the lead companies of the US 2nd Division were moving through hills on the east bank of the Yalu River, they were attacked by hordes of Chinese infantry. Before long, Chinese assault groups had smashed through their forward defences and were overrunning gun lines and rear areas. By the night of the 26th, the division had been pushed back 2 miles down the Yalu River. On its left, the 25th Division was also falling back. There was a complete loss of leadership, recalled Private Scarletta of the 35th Infantry. It was a nightmare, really. Many times I felt that we'd never make it out of there, that to survive this would be a miracle. Those Chinese were just fanatics, and they didn't place the value on life that we did. Yet these reverses were minor in comparison to the disaster taking place on the right of the 8th Army. There, the whole of the South Korean 2nd Corps was in headlong retreat, abandoning guns, vehicles, and equipment, and leaving an 80-mile gap in the Allied line between the 8th Army in the west and the US 10th Corps in the east. In all, 18 divisions of the Chinese 13th Army Group, more than 180,000 men, had been committed. With the 8th Army in danger of being cut off, Walker ordered its immediate retreat. At 1:30 p.m. on the 13th of November, the US 2nd Division commander, General Kaiser, ordered his men to break out to the south, but the huge nose-to-tail convoy had to run a 6-mile gauntlet of enemy fire and was cut to pieces. With the road blocked by blazing vehicles, many men sat motionless, incapable of even returning fire. When night came, Chinese infantry closed in for the kill. Only a few officers, like Colonel Skeldon of the 38th Infantry, kept their heads and led their men to safety. In just one afternoon, the 2nd Division lost 3,000 men and almost all its transport and equipment. It would be many months before this famous formation was considered capable of fighting again. Pyongyang was abandoned on the 5th of December. The 8th Army had suffered 11,000 casualties in the first few days of the Chinese offensive and was still in headlong retreat. Only 10th Corps, to the east of the central spine of mountains in North Korea, was able to salvage some honor from one of the most inglorious episodes in American military history. Ferociously attacked on the 27th of November by more than 100,000 Chinese troops, its 2 divisions, the 1st Marine and 7th Infantry, performed a classic fighting withdrawal down the road from the Chosan Reservoir towards the port of Hamhung. On the 10th of December, the 1st Marine Division arrived at Hamhung. It had sustained 4,400 battle and 7,300 non-battle casualties. The Chinese are said to have lost 37,000 men, many from the cold. But victory was theirs. On Christmas Eve 1950, the seaborne evacuation of 10th Corps and its South Korean allies, 100,000 men, from Hamhung to Pusan was completed. Meanwhile, the 8th Army struggled back beyond the 38th parallel. On the 4th of January 1951, Seoul was captured by the Chinese. Only at the end of the month, thanks to the vigorous leadership of General Matthew B. Ridgway, who had succeeded Walker, killed in a car crash in late December, was the line finally stabilized, deep inside South Korea. In April, MacArthur was relieved of his command and replaced by Ridgway. But the war still dragged on for another 2 years and ultimately claimed the lives of 450,000 South Koreans, 33,000 Americans, and 3,000 servicemen from other nations, including Britain. China and North Korea lost an estimated 1.5 million men. An armistice was finally signed in July 1953. The terms of the subsequent peace treaty simply re-established the pre-war borders of North and South Korea. Such an outcome could have been achieved before Christmas 1950 if MacArthur and the US government had not been so ready to underestimate the political will and fighting capability of the Chinese. Thank you.